In 1968, one company was handed almost the entire British car industry. It was called British Leyland. Under a single roof, it held Jaguar and Land Rover. It held the Mini and MG and Triumph and Rover and Austin and Morris. It built 4 out of every 10 new cars sold in Britain. It was a national champion, a giant built to take on the world. 17 years later, it was a national joke. And the most painful part is this. Almost every famous British car you can name, the Mini, the Jaguar, the Land Rover, the MG, survived. They are still built today, but not one of them is British-owned anymore. They were sold off one by one to Germany, to India, to China. Britain still makes cars. It just doesn't own them, and it all traces back to the day the giant was born. It began as a rescue. By the 1960s, Britain's car makers were a mess of warring companies, so the government pushed them together. British Motor Holdings, the home of Austin, Morris, MG and Jaguar, merged with Leyland, the maker of Triumph and Rover. The result, in 1968, was the British Leyland Motor Corporation. On paper, it was magnificent. 40% of the British market, nearly 200,000 workers, dozens of famous names. But a giant is only as strong as the way it is run. And from the very first day, British Leyland had a fatal flaw built into it. It was not one company. It was nearly a dozen old rivals, forced into a marriage none of them wanted, and all still fighting each other for the very same customers. Think about what that meant. Austin and Morris had spent decades as deadly rivals. Now they were the same company, and they still each built their own competing cars. So did Triumph and Rover. British Leyland was selling cars that stole sales from its own other cars. The same basic vehicle would appear as an Austin, a Morris, a Wolseley, and an MG, with a different badge and a different price, in showrooms that competed with each other. Instead of pooling its strength, the giant spent it fighting itself. There was no single plan, no single boss who could knock heads together. Money that should have built one brilliant new car was split a dozen ways to build a dozen mediocre ones. And while British Leyland argued with itself, a quiet, patient rival was sailing in from the east. Because there was a second problem, and it was even more destructive. The factories were at war. Britain in the 1970s was the home of the strike, and no company struck more than British Leyland. At the giant Longbridge plant in Birmingham, a union leader named Derek Robinson became so powerful the newspapers called him Red Robbo. In just 30 months, the plant he led walked out 523 times. 523 strikes. Production lines stood silent for weeks. Cars sat half-finished. Customers who waited months for a British Leyland car simply gave up and bought something else. Every walkout didn't just cost a day's production. It cost the company its reputation, one frustrated customer at a time. The workers were fighting the management, but together they were ruining the very thing that paid them all. And then there were the cars themselves. To compete, British Leyland rushed out new models, and they were, to put it kindly, not good. The Austin Allegro became a national punchline, a dumpy, unreliable car that for a time was even sold with a strange square steering wheel. The Morris Marina was so crude that decades later, a famous television show made a running joke of dropping pianos onto them. These were not just bad cars, they were a betrayal. While British Leyland was building the Allegro, the Japanese were sending over Datsuns and Toyotas that started every morning, did not rust, and did not break down. British buyers, who had loyally bought British for generations, drove a Marina for a year, then walked into a Japanese showroom and never came back. The giant was losing its own home market, car by car. By 1975, it was over. British Leyland, the national champion, 40% of the market, ran out of money. It could not pay its bills, and it was too big to be allowed to fail. Hundreds of thousands of jobs depended on it. So the British government did the only thing it felt it could. It took the company over. British Leyland was nationalised. The taxpayer now owned the wreckage. A government report, led by Sir Don Ryder, laid out the scale of the disaster. Outdated factories, too many models, terrible relations between workers and bosses. The company that was meant to conquer the world was now kept alive on public money, and the bill would run into the billions of pounds. There was one last fight left. A tough new boss, Sir Michael Edwards, took charge and did what no one else had dared. He closed factories, he took on the unions, and in 1979, he finally sacked Red Robbo himself. And then he did something that would once have been unthinkable. He went to Japan. British Leyland signed a deal with Honda. In 1981, the result arrived, the Triumph Acclaim. It was, in truth, a Honda, built in Britain, and for the first time in years, here was a British Leyland car that was actually reliable. It was a quiet humiliation and a lifeline. The company that was built to beat the world was now surviving by copying it. But the damage of the last decade was simply too deep. What was left was slowly broken apart and sold. The famous names were carved off, one by one. The shrinking business was renamed Rover, sold to British Aerospace, and then in 1994, sold again to the German company BMW. The maker of the Mini was now owned in Munich, and 6 years later, BMW broke it up for good. It kept the Mini, it sold Land Rover to Ford, and the last British core, MG and Rover, it sold to a group of businessmen for £10. £10 for what was left of the company that had once been 40% of Britain. They could not save it. In 2005, MG Rover collapsed. The Longbridge plant, where Red Robbo had called his strikes, where millions of British cars had been built, closed for good. Around 6,000 workers lost their jobs in a single week. The last great British-owned car maker was gone. So what really brought down Britain's car industry? It was not the Japanese. They were only selling better cars. It was a giant that was never really one company, a dozen rivals who spent their strength fighting each other instead of the world. It was factories that struck more than they built, and it was the slow, fatal habit of blaming someone else, while the customers quietly walked away. Today, Britain builds more cars than ever. The Mini, the Jaguar, the Land Rover, the Rolls-Royce roll out of British factories by the million. But the names on the gates are German and Indian and Chinese. A country that once owned its car industry now only builds it for others. British Leyland was not destroyed by its rivals. It was a giant that tore itself apart, and an entire nation's industry went down with it.